Hi, Brian and Candace. I'm adding you into the webinar now. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late because of some computer problems. I had to restart everything. So hopefully it's working okay now. You will notice that there is a chat window that I've enabled. If you can't get to it, or if you can't see or hear me, please let me know. And we can go ahead and get started. And people can jump in when they do. So this evening we'll be talking about Benin Kingdom. Initially I was just going to do the 17th to the 19th centuries, but I think in order to really understand what's happening during that time period, it's important to go back to the 13th century as well, which is pretty much the length of more contemporary Benin Kingdom history. And so we'll start with that. There are a couple of reasons why I think it's important for us to study Benin Kingdom. One is because, and Brian, we'll go back and do a little review on the historical spiral cycle so that you know what we're talking about. But this idea of voluntary divergence being what weakens a kingdom or a people, Benin Kingdom is a perfect example of how that happens. So we'll spend a little time talking about what happens when you voluntarily diverge from your traditions. We'll also talk about religious hegemony. And that sounds like a complex topic, but it's not really. Hegemony is the idea that if you make something seem normal and natural, people will almost uncritically accept it. So for example, when we say things like they'll be serving continental breakfast, we all accept that continental breakfast will include the things we're used to it including: danishes, coffee, tea, small things like that. Whereas on other continents, for example, when I was in Ghana, breakfast never had those things. It would be beans and boiled eggs and a lot of fruit. So the idea that continental we have accepted uncritically to mean one thing is an example of how hegemony works. So Benin Kingdom is an interesting microcosm to see how religious hegemony really works to shape a people. We'll also talk, when we're talking about religious hegemony, we'll talk a lot about form over function, which is, I think, one of the problems that Black folk have throughout history. We'll also talk about the differences between centralized and decentralized government structure in pre-colonial, pre-encounter Africa versus encounter or post-colonial Africa. And we'll also round out the discussion talking about women and their role in political governance in Benin Kingdom. Moving forward, it's important for us to review a little bit the historical spiral cycle, which is how I present history. It's kind of how I was taught to understand how history works. If you weren't here when we went through it, I'm going to go through it quickly, just good enough for you to get a general understanding of what we mean by voluntary divergence from a path. What you see before you is a spiral cycle. Now, Westerners tend to think of time as a linear thing. Yesterday happened in the past, tomorrow happens in the future, and today is in the present. And we kind of move forward in a very linear way. Well, in traditional African thought, time is not linear. It's cyclical. Things happen in seasons. I think African Americans hold true to that a whole lot more than we give ourselves credit for. And so using the historical spiral cycle to think about history allows us to view history in a very different way. And so when a kingdom or a group or a community or a society or even a person is completely sovereign, then they're here at the top of the spiral cycle where Ma'at is. And that means they're in complete control of their own destiny. They're living in divine order with those traditions that keep them sovereign and empowered. But what happens is, as people voluntarily shift from the things that keep them cohesive as a people, they open themselves up to weakness and invasion. And that's what Akoto and Akoto call Ogonye. which is a Shono term meaning divergence. You're diverging from those traditions that hold you true and safe as a people. And when you open up those cracks through your own disobedience or incongruence with your traditions, then you open yourself up to external enemies. And in African history, that is when we see colonialism come in. That's when the transatlantic slave trade, the Arabic slave trade, when those things begin to start. We call that ma'afa. When you're no longer a sovereign people, you're completely ruled, and your destiny is determined by another or other groups of people. And once you're in ma'afa for a period of time, you end up in total chaos and total subjectivity at the hands of someone else, and that's isfet, or maximum chaos. But isfet is not where we end up, because remember, time is cyclical. So if we're in chaos, we have the opportunity to lift ourselves out of that by voluntarily returning to those traditions that held us true. And that is the season of Kepra, or resurgence, recollection, remembering. And once you go through the remembering process, you actually start to build institutions that are used to maintain your sovereignty. That's the period of Karoka, and then you enter Ma'at again. And so that's kind of how we think about history. It's more important for those of us who belong to marginalized groups. It's more important for us to understand the consequences of events than it is necessarily a date on a calendar. And the historical spiral cycle helps us think about how human behavior drives the events rather than some chronological system driving the events. And so when we talk about Benin Kingdom, that idea of divergence is one that comes up over and over again and eventually leads to Ma'afa and Esfet. There are 4 major stages in Benin history, according to most historians. One is this period of antiquity, anything dating the 13th century. Now, in Benin Kingdom, now let me say this, Benin people either call themselves Bini, B-I-N-I, or they're the Edo people, E-D-O. And in their oral traditions, they link their origin to the Nile Valley. So they themselves say they came from the Nile Valley civilizations. That's what historians call the mythological period. There's not a whole lot of historical evidence of that. It simply exists in the oral traditions of the people. Now, I'm the kind of historian who believes people when they say that's where they come from, but there's not a lot of material evidence that indeed the Beni people come from Nile Valley. But it's important to know that that's where they trace themselves. Then you have the 13th century, which is the Ogiso dynasty. This is the dynasty that precedes colonialism. It also enters colonialism, and it also leads to the downfall of Benin Kingdom into what we now know as Benin country. Again, the oral tradition says they originate in the Nile Valley. And this is where Benin Kingdom is interesting when you learn about political structures in Africa, because it changed so often. Now, if you look 13th century, there were 31 consecutive rulers. They call themselves Oba. And the first official Oba came from Ife. Now, the way the oral tradition goes, there was a need at one point to move and to bring in a ruler from outside of Benin Kingdom. And when they brought in this ruler from outside, they actually went to the city of Ife, which is a neighboring Yoruba land, and they brought in the prince of Oduduwa. Oduduwa is said to be the oldest human in Yoruba cosmogony. And they brought in this Yoruba priest to become their first ruler of the Ogiso dynasty. What's interesting about that history is historians themselves say what we're really hearing is a story of conquest, that the Yoruba ruled over Benin at one point and assigned a king to Benin Kingdom. But Benin, because history is a tool of hegemony, it tells us who a people are. They don't admit that they were ever ruled externally. What they say instead is that there was a need to go get a king to bring in. And then we have the encounter period. It's a civil war period around the 17th, 18th century. And then we have what we know as Benin today. Those are the four major stages of Benin history. Now, it's important to look at this map just so that you can see some of the cultural influences. As you can tell, Benin Kingdom is here. We have Ghana very close, and then you have Yoruba land, or the Kingdom of Oyo, excuse me, is very close. You have the Kingdom of Mali. So there's a lot of cultural exchange. And for those of us who are familiar with African spirituality, we can see a lot of carryover between these groups. We see a lot of deities who are Yoruba deities. We see them show up in Benin. When we get to the next slide, I'll talk specifically about how that happens. But because of the trade between and among these people, there's a lot of cultural carryover from one tradition to another. And so it makes sense to talk about them. When people talk about the kingdoms of ancient Africa, they tend to group these because they were so close in cultural politics. Political structure in Benin changes over time. There's a lot of change toward the 17th and 18th centuries, but the basic political organization doesn't shift that much. The village was the basic political unit around which people were organized, and in their in the village, people were organized by age grades. So your peers who you're the same age with, you're kind of in a community with them. You're also organized by lineage, so your families and your kinship are organized. They are a patrilineal people. They inherit names and titles through the father's lineage. So it matters who your father is, lesser who your mother is. Now that shifts a little bit, and we're going to talk about how that shifts. But even in the shift, they remain patrilineal, although they become matrifocal. Patrilineal meaning the name and the authority, the money, the titles are passed down through the father's line. Matrifocal meaning the mother becomes, later becomes the center of importance in the family. Again, we talked about they link themselves to Nile Valley and the oral tradition, so they see themselves as a very old, a very ancient people. That's important because they are very proud people. And we also know that the Ogiso dynasty lasted until the 13th century when it ended under the Oba Owodo. I want to go back a little bit and tell you a little bit of the creation story that they have. For those of us who know something about the Yoruba creation story, then these two stories sound very similar. Again, it's evidence of that cultural carryover between the two kingdoms. So according to the Bini people, the creator decided to manifest earth and to populate it with people. And at the time, the world was covered with water. And so the creator selected 3 men, 3 sons, to go to earth to create earth as we know it now. And those 3 sons were allowed to choose what power they would have when they entered into the earthly realm. The oldest son chose to have wealth. The next one chose to have occult power. And the third one, as he was standing there thinking about what to choose, a toucan who was sitting in the highest tree on earth said, "Hey, bring a snail shell." Now, for those of us who are familiar with Yoruba cosmogony, this should sound familiar because we know in their creation story, a snail shell is very important to Obatala, who comes down to help start earth. So the 3 sons descend to the water. They are on a canoe. And the youngest of the sons takes the snail shell he brought with him and he turns it upside down. And it floods the earth with sand, creating dry land for the first time on earth. Because it was something new to them, they were afraid to get out of the canoe. And because they were afraid to get out, they released a chameleon, which started walking on the earth to prove that it indeed was firm, solid land. Again, this is very, very similar to the Yoruba creation story where a chameleon is important with to step. Others are then assigned when the creator comes from heaven on a chain, again, Yoruba cosmogony. The creator comes down and he assigns each of them a different realm of earth to take care of. The youngest son is named as the ruler of dry land. and he names it Agabon. And the oldest son was given control of the waters, and he becomes known as Olokun. Again, for those of us who know something about Yoruba traditional spirituality, we know Olokun remains the deity associated with oceans. And Olokun becomes very important to religious hegemony later. Olokun is seen as the god of wealth, and we'll talk about, when we talk about religious hegemony, we'll talk about why that may be. The third son becomes someone who is associated with occult power. He's also associated with death. Now, some historians call him evil, but for those of us who understand traditional African spirituality, just because you can do evil does not necessarily mark you as one who is evil. But it is he that ensures that all things must die. And so the Benin cosmogony says that the Oba, any person who rules Benin, is indeed a descendant of that youngest son who was given the right to rule over dry land by the Creator. So Obas in Benin Kingdom always trace their lineage and their ancestry to this third son of the Creator. And because of that, they have a lot of social taboos because they have to present themselves as divine. So they don't eat in public, because if you're immortal, you don't really need to eat, right? So they don't eat in public. They have a lot of taboos, and they have to be away, set apart from the people a lot to try to substantiate this idea that they are indeed immortal. And because they are immortal, they have the right to lead. I want to go back a little bit to this politics of Benin Kingdom. The last ruler of the Ojiso dynasty had very little control over his son, and because of his lack of control, his later descendant, Oba Iwedo, became the first paramount ruler of the kingdom. So up until Oba Iwedo, all the kings of Benin kind of shared rule with the village chiefs. It was not until Iwedo becomes Oba, or king, that the chiefs are then subordinated beneath the authority of the king. And what he does to support this is to reorganize the palace so that he's no longer sharing authority with traditional chiefs and rulers. What he does is he divides the palace into three main groups. You have the Iwebo, and this group of people, they're given charge of the royal regalia, and eventually they're given authority to rule the trade and finance associated with Benin Kingdom. Benin did a lot. It was a very warlike kingdom towards the end, as it began to voluntarily trade with the Portuguese, the Dutch, and eventually the British. They supplied other African ethnic groups to the slave trade. They also traded a lot of ivory and bronze. They were metallurgists. So they were a very rich people because of this trade, and because of their involvement in the slave trade, they were also very warlike. So the Iwebo were in charge of that trade and finance, and also for making sure the royal regalia was taken care of. The Iwego was another group within the palace. These were the Obas, or the king's personal assistants and couriers. So they were the messengers. They took care of the wants and the needs of the king, etc. And then you have the Ibiwe. These were the caretakers of the Oba's children and wives. All of these were groups of men within the palace. Later, there is a fourth category, well, a fourth person who becomes the Iyase, and the Iyase becomes the head of the military, of the Benin armies. But what the king began to do, what Iwedo began to do that was a little bit different, was that he took what had been traditionally a decentralized kingdom, made it more centralized, and began to play these different groups against each other. Because he had sole authority and sole right to grant chieftaincy titles, to grant plots of land to people, etc., he began to play this disunity, and they competed with one another for his favor. And because of that, he was able to control a lot of power at the time. Under his rule, the kingdom continued to expand and became, like I said, very warlike. Horses, bows, and swords became introduced during his reign. It increased in the 15th century under Oba Iwore, who made the town, Benin town, a city, and he turned the kingdom into an empire. So he began to rule more ruthlessly. He organized craftsmen, artisans, and ritual specialists throughout the kingdom into guilds. Again, this mirrors what Owedo did within the palace. Iwari begins to take that disunity and spread it throughout the kingdom by organizing these guilds. And the guilds had to work to gain his favor. And so they competed with one another to stay in his good graces. Excuse me. Eventually, chiefs who were displaced by this new centralized governance became very unhappy, and a group of them formed a permanent and official opposition to the palace. By the 17th century, their leader, the Iyasi, would become the commander of the Benin armies, as I said. And this began a season of internal strife that would last for years and eventually lead to the dismantling of Benin Kingdom as it once existed. Iwari, because of this growing faction that was in opposition to him, he tried to achieve some stability by naming his son, before he died, his successor. Before that time, the successor was not named until the Oba was deceased. But Iwari shifted that tradition. Now again, if we think about divergence, we see a lot of change happening in Benin political governance that begins to weaken those structures that had held the kingdom as a sovereign kingdom for a while. He named his youngest son, Ozolua, as his successor, and he actually expanded the kingdom even further than his father had. They became even more warlike. Some historians call them a war machine. And he expanded it as far as he could. The Oyo Empire, the Yoruba people, now they couldn't crush them, so that became one boundary, the Oya Empire. The Niger River became one boundary because they just couldn't, they wouldn't go past that. And then the Nupe Kingdom also became I don't want to say enemy, but that became one of the boundaries. Now, once they reached that maximum size, we see a rise in religious hegemony. So again, religious hegemony is this idea that in order to substantiate or to justify why people are in rule, they begin to really play on that idea that they are divine. And so you see the three images on the screen. One of them is a little bit older representation of an Oba, and you see he's given himself the mudfish fins associated with, he's presenting himself as the god Olokun. So if you remember, they are claiming that they are descending from that youngest son of the creator who was the god of land. But then in the 17th century, we begin to see them representing themselves as linked to Olokun, who is the god of the water. Now, one of the reasons they may be linking themselves to Olokun is because they were beginning to do trade with Europeans who were crossing water. And Olokun, remember, was linked to water and to untold riches. And their relationship with the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British was bringing in a lot of riches into the kingdom. And so the kings began to represent themselves not just as a descendant of the youngest son, but now a descendant of Olokun in particular. So we see the 17th century Obas in particular are very weak compared to the preceding Obas, who had amassed that centralized political authority. In the 17th century, remember, they're being threatened by this group of chiefs. And rather than confronting them militarily, because remember the Iyasi controls the armies, they start to try to control the people through this religious hegemony and saying, we are the rightful rulers because we are the ones that are divine. So to convince the Benin constituents of their power, the Obas restrict themselves even further into the palace. They don't show themselves often because, again, they want to appear as mysterious as possible. They don't eat in public. When they're seen in public, they are dressed very heavily. They always cover their legs. They walk with a limp because that's supposed to prove they have the mudfish tales like Olokun, etc. Now, in reality, these 17th century Obas were very weak because they were handpicked by chiefs so that they could be easily manipulated. But they all understood that they had to convince the people that they had a right to rule. So if you look at the carving in the middle, Benin Kingdom is famous for its bronze heads. And this is an example of a representation of one of the Obas. So what you notice on his head is a crown of 3 birds. Birds were linked to supernatural occult power. So he's saying, I'm literally crowned by divinity. What is coming out of his nostrils are serpents. Again, a very sacred animal for Benin people. And he's saying, I literally breathe divinity. So you begin to see a lot of this art begin to try to justify through religious hegemony the Oba's right to rule. Now let's go back a little bit. During the 16th century, the use of art to substantiate the Oba's right to rule increased exponentially. Oba Iware's strength was associated with his occult abilities. Oba Ozoluwa's warrior, like Rain, was persevered because he also had access to occult power, spiritual power. But his son, Isiji's association with occult power supported his rulership, but it was not his own power or occult spiritual power that preserved him. It was that of his mother. And so we began to see the introduction of what we now know as the Queen Mothers of Benin. Now, most of us are familiar with this carving. Many of us may not know that it's a woman because Beni people, Edo people, carve their masks in a very sexually ambiguous way. You can't really tell it's a woman. But this is Ioba Idia, or wife of the Oba Idia. She played a significant role in her son's rule, and she is the first Benin queen mother of record. The fact that the Edo people carve their carvings with this sexual ambiguity may tell us something about how they view women and how they view who has a right to political authority. Idia was the wife of Oba Ozuluwa, and she was the mother of Isiji, Oba Isiji, who ruled from 1504 to 1550. As the wife of Ozuluwa, Idia rose quickly to power in the palace. Now remember, the palace is organized into those 3 major groups, but you also have female ritual specialists in the palace, and that becomes important to her reign. She gave birth to her first son, Isiji, and there was some disagreement between whether or not she gave birth to his first son or another one of his wives gave birth to the first son. But what mattered most was not necessarily which son was born first on that particular day, but whose birth was announced first. And it was Isiji's birth that was announced first. In the oral traditions, people say that she used her occult power to make sure the rival son's birth was not announced. Some people say it was just her manipulation of the different factions in the palace that prevented the other birth from being announced first. But regardless of how she did it, we do know that she used her political authority, perhaps her spiritual power, to assure her son's ascension to power. When her husband died, there began to be struggles between Idia's son, Isiji, who had been sent to Portuguese boarding schools, who had been trained by the Portuguese, and who was baptized by the Portuguese. So Idia's son was, for all practical purposes, a victim of colonialism. And he had strife with his brother Aronron, who was the child born first, whose birth was not announced. And they had a lot of strife. Aronron had tried to assassinate his brother many times, but he always failed. And according to oral tradition and what the historians now write, it was because Idia always interceded with her spiritual power. She always protected her son. It got to the point where Aronron had attempted several times to assassinate his brother. And when he figured out that Idia was the one protecting him, he went and sought out his own ritual specialist, also a female, to try to figure out how to defeat his brother. Now, long story short, The two of them go to war. And it was a very long war. Oranran, in his attempt to take control of Benin, moved the capital to Udo from Benin City and set himself as a king. So what was going on for a period of time was that you had Isiji ruling in Benin City, you had his brother ruling in Udo, and both of them had different factions of support, and there was a lot of contestation, and the civil war seemed inevitable. After 3 different waves of battle, Oranran was eventually defeated because he was attacked. His army was attacked during planting season, and most of his soldiers were farmers, so they weren't present for the war. When the ones that were there were distracted. Some people say that was Idia's decision, the Queen Mother's decision. As a tribute to her strength and her role in his victory, her son gave her the title Ioba, or the Queen Mother. And it was from this period on that only a man strong enough to assert his mother with this title was seen as entitled to rule Benin. As Queen Mother, Iobas were responsible for the protection and well-being of their sons, and therefore the entire kingdom. She actually has her own palace. That position has her own palace. She is the only person with the same authority given the king in commissioning official royal art made from fine materials, and therefore her own brand of religious hegemony. So she is the only person other than the king that can order this art being made to substantiate not only her own right to being a queen mother, but more importantly, her son's right to rule. In this particular carving of Idia, those 2 marks between her eyes represent, they were once had metal plates in them. They represent supposedly the medicinal, spiritual ingredients that had been impacted into her head when she became a wife of an Oba, giving her that spiritual power. It is at this point that the Edo people, who were incredibly patrilineal, began to become more matrifocal because they begin to recognize that it is women who know best how to manipulate people, how best to strategize in war, and they turn to them for political and spiritual protection. And so that was just a quick, fast, and dirty overview of Benin Kingdom. I wanted us to kind of end there because next week, not next week, but the next session we have, I want us to move to Dahomey Kingdom to continue our conversations about women in pre-colonial Africa. Dahomey is home of the people we sometimes refer to as Amazons, that they were the fiercest warriors of that time period, and they continue the conversation we start with Idia, this important role that African women have, not only in families, but in politics and governance. I think, unfortunately, the way Africa is represented in pop culture and Western media, we're told that the women are suppressed, and in some cases, because of encounter stimulus, that may be true, but traditionally it is not true, that women are seen as very powerful individuals capable of ruling, of protection, of ensuring the lineage, etc., etc. So I want to stop there and open us up for conversations. I want us to think about religious hegemony as we talk. I want us to think about the role of women in community. And I also want us to think about what happens in a decentralized versus a centralized political organization. So I'm going to open it up and ask, does anyone have anything to say?
Hi, Tiffany. It's Candace.
Hey, Candace.
Hey, in relationship to the presentation, I'll have to say, because since I'm not really in I guess, a structured religious group at the moment, I can only speak of, like my upbringing, which was Christianity. Um, I can see that when it comes to the different sects, like when it comes to like a Seventh Day Adventist or African Methodists, they have different rules for women and how they can lead in the church. And sorry, I have a little.
That's okay.
Sorry, hold on. They have different roles in how they can lead in the church. Like and in some denominations, women aren't allowed to be pastors. However, other denominations allow them to do so. Some can sit on the pulpit, some can't. And and I look at the connection to, I guess, from the Middle Passage, the worship when the slaves were brought here to North America, enslaved, because there were already black and brown people already in North America.
Right.
When people were brought over here, they had bits and pieces still of their culture, which, like devotion, was still like a small snippet of, you know, of their culture mixed with them, I guess, sending a message to their people when they're, you know, what they're planning to do if they're going to run away. You know, it was the last song that they sang, you know, of upliftment before they were going to flee, or, you know, any type of message they were sending to the people. But I can see that. And I also see even now, so today, that the women are definitely becoming the leaders of the revolution, even present day. It isn't really until the women folks say, hey, you know, I'm tired of my babies getting killed on the street, until collectively the people pay attention to the issue.
I think I think that's a very important point. We see a lot of I don't even know what to call it, but this, some people say it's fear of female power, but some people have been conditioned to not think it doesn't work the same way. Female power does not work the same way. It is not as aggressive. Now, Idia herself, the first queen mother, it is said that she went to war as a general. So she was on the, you know, on the battlefront with her son when he was fighting. But that she is unusual, because most female power is not physically aggressive like that. It is aggressive in that occult way. It is aggressive in the very subversive. We work relationships, we work our connections, we work behind the scenes kind of way. And I think because of external factors, it has shifted. And I think that both men and women today, and I'm not saying all of us, but I think there are some men and women today who are acting out of character.
Agreed.
And we have been put in a position. I don't think women belong on. This is just me. I don't think we belong on the aggressive front lines. I don't think that's our place. But because we have waited and it has not happened, that some of our brothers have stood up for us, that we have found ourselves in that place. When we think about Yaa Asantewaa and the Asante Kingdom, the only reason she went to war was because the men refused to fight. And she said, if you don't fight, then we, the women, will. And I think that we have to become more reflective about why we do the things we do. And we have to, I think we have to demand more of one another, not just of our brothers, but of other women too.
Agreed.
We just have to do that work. But that's why history is important, because we'll be convinced, you know, the way they present African culture to us, we'll be presented with the idea that African women don't have any power. And it's just simply not true. It's not true now, and it certainly wasn't true then.
I hate to jump off, but I have to put my youngest to bed.
No, go ahead.
Sorry about that, but I really wanted to catch this one.
All right. Talk to you
so
soon.
much.
So Brian, Jessica, Amina, anybody have anything else to say?
I don't really have too much to add, but I really appreciate the info. I only found out probably about 6 or 7 months ago that my ancestry goes back to Benin and Togo. So I'm still barely scratching the surface, trying to learn as much as I can about the culture. So Appreciate the info.
No problem. Benin is a very interesting period in history to look at. But if you look at what happens there, just there, you don't get the full picture because there is so much overlap,
Yeah.
between them. So hopefully the next one, when we go into Dahomey, you'll get a little bit more of what's going on with Benin, because we'll talk about the relationship between Dahomey and Benin Kingdom as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us. Anybody else? Okay, so we'll close out. If you all of you registered for this one, so I have your email address. I'll be sending out the link for registration to the next session. Because classes are starting back up for me, we'll move from doing every other week to doing once a month, preferably the last Sunday of the month, if that works for everybody. So there will be a link coming soon with the registration for the next one, which will be on Dahomey Kingdom. Again, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to our next time. Take care.
Thanks.